Our next speaker is Rabbi Dr. Reuven Leigh. Dr. Leigh is the director of the Chabad House and is an affiliated lecturer in the Faculty of Divinity at the University of Cambridge. His main research focus is on the philosophical importance of the 20th century rabbinic thinkers. Dr. Leigh's presentation will focus on Jonathan Sacks as a biblical exegete. Dr. Leigh, please.
Okay, good morning. Maybe just like Jessica, I was thinking there was also maybe a missing list of names for Rabbi Sacks. I think maybe I would add on top of Rabbi, Law, Doctor, also Chassid. And the truth is, if I would have done my research before I handed in my application to give a paper and knew what I was going to say, I would have had a subtitle. In addition to Jonathan Sacks as a biblical exegete, I would have said, a Chassid from Cambridge. Now, I'm genuinely concerned of being stereotyped as that guy who sees every call for papers as an invitation to talk about himself. But nevertheless, I think there is an acute lack of appreciation and focus in this new and emerging field of Sacks studies on the significant impact of both the intellectual culture of Cambridge and the Torah of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, as well as Chabad thought in general, on Sacks' philosophical outlook and on his biblical exegesis in particular. Now, due to the limited available time to me, I will leave the discussion of Cambridge to one side for the moment and focus today on the influence of the Rebbe and Chabad on Jonathan Sacks, the biblical exegete, and what I perceive as a blind spot in current scholarship on Sacks. A prime example of this blind spot in Sacks scholarship can be found in Alan Jotkowitz's article in the February 2022 issue of Modern Judaism, titled "The Return of Biblical Theology, Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks and the Theological Literary Movement," where there is no mention of the influence of Chabad thought on Sacks' biblical theology. Similarly, and I hope no one takes offense at this comment, there were a number of papers yesterday that I felt could have benefited from greater engagement with the Chabad dimension of Sacks' thought. My hope, therefore, is that this paper will demonstrate why this is an unfortunate omission, as well as providing useful scholarly resources for future research. Now, to begin with, it may be worth pointing out Sacks' general attitude towards Jewish mysticism. For an appreciation of Rabbi Sacks' understanding of and approach to Jewish mysticism, let me signpost his lecture titled "The Practical Implications of Infinity," delivered at the International Symposium on Jewish Mysticism, which was held in London in 1980, and later published in the book "To Touch the Divine," where he demonstrates a deep appreciation and understanding of core mystical ideas as they are explicated through the lens of Chabad thought. Another important text is A Mystical Covenant, which is an excerpt from the inaugural lecture of the Lubavitcher Rebbe Memorial Lectures delivered shortly after the Rebbe's passing in 1994. As an aside, and to bring in a certain Cambridge element, I was particularly amused by this passage. Quote, "What is a mystic? I don't know. My Oxford English Dictionary tells me that a mystic is one who seeks by contemplation and self-surrender to obtain union with or absorption into the deity, or one who believes in the spiritual apprehension of truths inaccessible to the understanding." And I'm sure that's right. But I prefer the very simple definition given to me by a fellow student when 25 years ago I went to study in Kfar Chabad. He said, "The difference between me and you is that you are a philosopher from Cambridge. Therefore, you believe in the world, and you ask whether God exists. I am just a chassid. I believe in God. And I ask whether the world exists. That is a mystic," end quote. The extent to which Sacks' understanding of Jewish mysticism should be considered faithful or not, however we might want to categorize faithful, is deserving of scholarly attention. But it should be in no doubt that his attraction to and appreciation of Jewish mysticism, especially as it manifests in Chabad thought, is a significant component of his thought in general, and as we will see shortly, in his biblical exegesis in particular. To further accentuate this point, I would like to now say a few words about Rabbi Sacks' PhD. In the memorial lecture I just quoted, Rabbi Sacks describes how the Rebbe advised him to change his planned thesis topic on some aspect of philosophy to instead be focused on rabbinic thought. The PhD would ultimately be titled "Rabbinic Concepts of Responsibility for Others, a Study of the Commandments of Rebuke and the Idea of Mutual Surety." The Rebbe also asked him to send him a copy of his thesis when it was complete, as he would like to read it. When the time came, and the PhD was complete, Rabbi Sachs says he felt a bit ridiculous wasting the Rebbe's time, but he was encouraged to send it and received a handwritten note from the Rebbe with 2 comments. In one, the Rebbe wanted to know why he hadn't included anything on Tanya chapter 32, a chapter which explains the mystical connotations of the mitzvah of Ahavat Yisrael. At the time, Rabbi Sachs was confused, as it was a work of rabbinic thought and halachic thought and not mystical thought. However, in his tribute to the Rebbe after his passing, Rabbi Sachs expounded on the importance of this chapter and how he then understood why this mystical dimension was so important to the rabbinic and halachic concept of responsibility for others. And I quote, "And it was that mystical vision which reached its highest expression in chapter 32 of Tanya, the chapter that the Rebbe had wanted me to quote in my doctorate, because in that chapter, Rabbi Shneur Zalman explains that Jews are called literally brothers and sisters to one another, because each Jew's soul is in the one God, and therefore we are one soul. It is only in terms of bodily presence that we are separated from one another. And just as there can be no divisions within God, so there can be no divisions within the collective soul of the Jewish people. Therefore, when we live at the level of the soul, there is unity amongst us. But when we live at the level of the body, there is disunity amongst Jews. When we live at the level of the soul, we fulfill the command that you shall love your neighbor, not as yourself, but because he is yourself. And it is that mystical idea that lies at the heart of Jewish law." Now, Rabbi Sachs was no stranger to Tanya chapter 32. In his now confirmed first published essay in Tradition 1973, not yet confirmed?
73, yeah.
I think we were confirmed, yeah.
Yeah, it was confirmed.
He boldly critiques Rabbi Soloveitchik's lonely man of faith from an explicitly Chabad mystical stance. And I quote, "What, then, is the place of alienation and loneliness in the Jewish analysis of the emotions? Of course, there is no single analysis, but we can detect 2 recurring tendencies of thought. The one, in line with Rabbi Soloveitchik, the other which I wish to present here. A classic source for the alternative phenomenology is the famous chapter 32 of the Tanya of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi. In this chapter of Tanya, Sachs sees a clear statement of the phenomenology of a community of faith and proceeds to analyze the chapter and use it to present his alternative interpretation of Bereshit to counter the reading of Rabbi Soloveitchik. Here we see Sachs unabashedly and unashamedly siding with a Chabad interpretive approach. It has been a matter of surprise to me how we have heard so many times at this conference that this essay should become required reading and rereading in order to begin to appreciate the contours of Sachs' later thought, and yet so little attention has been paid to the explicitly Chabad basis for his argument. It is important to note that a well-known statement by Sachs himself could be partly to blame for these omissions in Sachs' scholarship. As quoted by Miri yesterday, he surmised the experience of that fateful trip in the summer of 1968 as follows. "The Rav challenged me to think, the Rebbe challenged me to lead." However, if we look beyond this simplistic formulation, we find that Sachs was deeply engaged with and affected by the Rebbe's teachings, and saw in him what he called a revolutionary thinker. And I quote from his Jewish Chronicle article, "In Search of the Soul, 30 Years of the Lubavitcher Rebbe," which was published on the 1st of February 1980 to mark 30 years of the Rebbe's leadership. Quote, "It is difficult to say in Judaism who is a revolutionary thinker. Essentially, every revolution is no more than the saying of ancient truths in a new way. But within these parameters, so different from those of science, the Rebbe is a revolutionary. He has enthroned Chassidut not as one of the limbs, but as the heart of Judaism. He is a systematic and conceptual thinker on the largest scale. And, more than anything, he continually drives together the highest abstract truth and the most specific call for action, spanning the continuum of the whole range of Jewish study." And he continues, "It is perhaps the case that his fame as a leader, organizer, and initiator of communal projects has impeded a measured assessment of his originality as a thinker. But, essentially, the 2 facets of his work are one. The comprehensiveness of his thought and action are part of the same drive, the unity of the Torah and the unity of the Jewish people." End quote. And we see this admiration for the Rebbe's teaching already in the 1973 Tradition article as well, which in footnote 17 on the notion of Teshuvah and the Baal Teshuvah, Sachs writes, quote, "See on this, for example, the present Lubavitcher Rebbe Shlita Likutei Sichot 5730 on Parshat Vayikra, for a remarkable account of the unifying power of the Baal Teshuvah, end quote. Which leads me to my final point on the significance of the Rebbe's talks to the development of Rabbi Sachs as a biblical commentator. Now, just a few quick words of background and explanation regarding the Rebbe's talks, which we're going to need to know. The Rebbe would deliver sichot at Farbrengens at Hasidic gatherings on a regular basis, at least once a month on Shabbat Mevarchim, the Shabbat before the new month, as well as on biblical, rabbinic, and Hasidic festivals. These talks would be transcribed, and towards the end of the 1960s, they developed a new approach where transcripts from earlier years were reworked and converted into scholarly essays on a range of topics, but commonly on biblical commentary. These essays were edited extensively by the Rebbe himself. After a number of years, these weekly pamphlets would be collated into volumes under the title Likutei Sichot, resulting in a set of 39 volumes. In the tradition footnotes, going back to I just quoted footnote 17, Rabbi Sachs was referring to the Sikha of the Rebbe delivered on Shabbat Vayikra in 5730, 1970, which was then published as an edited essay for Shabbat Vayikra 5731, 1971, and which would later be published in Likutei Sichot, Volume 7. Now, Rabbi Sachs' initial exposure to the Rebbe's talks was in one-on-one learning sessions with Rabbi Shmuel Leigh, the Lubavitch University chaplain, during his time as an undergraduate in Cambridge. Rabbi Leigh would travel to Cambridge on a regular basis and give a non-text-based class to a group of students. However, in the half an hour or so before the class, he would learn with Rabbi Sachs from the text of a Sikha. As noted earlier, Rabbi Sachs also spent 6 months studying in Kvar Chabad, where in addition to Talmud study, he was also engaged with the study of the Rebbe's Sichot. A few years later, in 1973, a supporter of Lubavitch UK challenged one of its directors, Rabbi Freivish Vogel, that Lubavitch is doing wonderful outreach work, but it is lacking in any serious intellectual contribution. Rabbi Vogel rose to the challenge and approached Rabbi Sachs to help translate and adapt Sichot of the Rebbe in a sophisticated style. Rabbi Sachs would learn specifically chosen Sichot with Rabbis Vogel and Leigh, and would then produce an English rendition under the title Torah Studies, which would then be distributed to the Lubavitch mailing list. These adaptations would in 1986 be collated in a volume under the title Torah Studies, which some have said is Rabbi Sachs' first book. However, I would like to suggest that, in fact, the first book of Rabbi Sachs was in 1982, which was a Swedish translation of his these weekly pamphlets from 1973 under the title Torah Tankar, which means Torah Thoughts in Swedish. So I think if anyone wants to argue, I believe 1982 to be the first published book of Rabbi Sachs, and it was in Swedish. Now, it is my contention that these sichot provide the paradigmatic framework for Rabbi Sachs' subsequent biblical commentary, and it is easily identifiable throughout the Covenant and Conversation series for anyone familiar with the sichot of the Rebbe. To get a sense of Rabbi Sachs' impression of these sichot of the Rebbe, let me quote some passages from Rabbi Sachs' introduction to the 1986 edition of Torah Studies. Time and again, a talk will be set in motion by a seemingly microscopic tension, a question or a comment by Rashi, perhaps, or a problem in understanding a halacha, a practical provision of Jewish law. Once in motion, however, the argument leads us into fresh perspectives, provisional answers and new questions, until we climb rung by rung to the most elevated vantage points. From here, as we survey the ground beneath us in its wildest of contexts, the initial question is not only resolved, but also revealed as the starting point of a major spiritual search. The question only existed because we were looking at the surface, not fathoming the depths of Torah. Each talk moves from the specific to the general, the finite to the infinite, and back again. Each invites us to undergo a profound transformation in our way of seeing the world and ourselves. Though when we return at the end of the Sikha to the question which we began, everything has changed. Key themes recur: the inseparability of the soul from God, the constant demands and possibility of teshuvah, the unity of Israel, the error of despair, the insistent light beneath the dark surfaces of history. These are the motifs of Chassidut, and are like a continuing thread through the Rebbe's teachings. And he finishes, these talks then are addressed with relentless clarity to the contemporary Jewish condition. Their implicit starting point is the darkness of a post-Holocaust world, in which spirituality, moral conviction, and the divine purpose of creation seem almost beyond reach. Their tacit faith is that step by step we can be led from the present moment of confusion to the timeless lucidity of Torah, beyond the low clouds to the infinite light. I'd like to finish and conclude with a story that happened when Rabbi Sachs came to Cambridge in the early 2000s, when I myself had just first arrived in Cambridge, and I think it can inform some things of where this can be moved forward. So I do not recall which book he was promoting, but he came and he was speaking in the old library of Emmanuel College, and he was talking specifically about the importance of the 7 Noahide laws and the importance of reaching out to the non-Jewish world and providing a real sense of moral responsibility, themes that we're all familiar with. And he gave this fantastic talk, and anyone familiar with the Sichot of the Rebbe would know that this was a particular campaign which the Rebbe initiated in the mid-1980s and spoke consistently for the rest of his life about the importance of promoting the 7 Noahide laws. And there was a particular configuration of the Rebbe's argument about why that was a necessary thing to be doing today, even though historically this was something that was never done. And as I'm listening to Rabbi Sachs, I can hear these sichot flowing through his ideas and the structure of the argument. And I was very new in Cambridge at the time, I was young, and it was very exciting. And afterwards, when I had a chance to speak to him, I went up to him and I said, Rabbi Sachs, I said, it was like hearing someone chaza a sikha of the Rebbe, someone repeating a sikha of the Rebbe. It was beautiful. And he said, I like to think of myself as a Lubavitcher in plain clothes. Which, of course, Rabbi Sachs always has a nice way of making everyone feel good about themselves, and it definitely did make myself feel good. And for those not familiar with the English idiom, you sort of have uniformed police officers and you have plainclothes police officers, who are usually undercover. It's the idea of being undercover. And those of us who both grew up in Anglo Jewry and then worked, and I came back to start working in Anglo Jewry, I came to Cambridge, there was our greatest product of Chabad on campus and Chabad campus activity was Rabbi Sachs. And there was an understanding that I was not going to try and take advantage of that or make it, because he was in a delicate position in his role as chief rabbi. And people within Chabad, I do think, understood that he needed to present himself in certain ways, and we knew how to handle that distance. Probably some didn't at times, but we tried out. I know I did to recognize that. But we saw after the end of his chief rabbinate, when he spoke at the Kinus HaShluchim, how he was really able to express himself clearly. And I think that now, after his passing, and we're developing this possibility of Sachs studies, and to really consider him, I think there should be a greater freedom and allow us to think of him not just as a rabbi, a lord, and a professor, but also as a chassid.